Scribes and the witnesses of the translation of the Book of Mormon spoke and wrote of the miracles they witnessed multiple times throughout their lives. Their various accounts include several repeated elements. They saw Joseph using seer stones, either the ones found together with the plates, or a separate single stone Joseph had found earlier in his life. Modern SITH proponents are privileging the SITH narrative over the canonical narrative, simply accepting the SITH accounts at face value without subjecting them to critique or evaluation. I'm obviously not a trained historian, but even as I've looked at the sources, I can't really piece together exactly how I think it was done. Mormonism with the Mirth, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. So this is going to be part 2, where we're going to be doing more of an analysis of the Seer Stone versus Urim and Thummim accounts for the Mormon translation. Part 1, I really went through a lot of the main sources from Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery, some of the scribes such as Emma Smith, Martin Harris, David Whitmer, one of the 3 witnesses. We had a look at John Whitmer, people like Joseph Knight Sr., Michael Morse, Elizabeth Cowdery, Lucy Mack Smith, as well as newspaper reports or people relating it secondhand. And I think sort of the conclusion that we came to at the end of that is that there's quite a few sources that support the Urim and Thummim being used. There's a few, if I have up here on the screen. Here, the conclusion we came to is that there are 25 sources that I found that talk about the Urim and Thummim being used in the translation of the plates. I found about 6 that support the Urim and Thummim over the plates. I found 3 to 5 talking about the spectacles being put in a hat. I found 13 to 15 talking about Seer Stone in a hat. And I found 8 or 9 talking about both either the Seer Stone or the Urim and Thummim. Sometimes they say it was the Urim and Thummim, but then after the lost 116 pages, then it was a Seer Stone. And I think the thoughts that I had at the end of that video as I looked through it is that the historical record is not clean cut. There are different sources that paint a different picture. And while I think there's a lot of consistency that they're saying, there was no manuscript, no notes that Joseph was working from, he was using one of the 2 translation instruments, either the Seer Stone or the spectacles of the Urim and Thummim, there was a lot of conflicting statements, particularly David Whitmer. At one point he's saying it was the Urim and Thummim, and then he would say, no, it's the Seer Stone in the hat, not the Urim and Thummim. And I could see already that just looking at all of the sources, it's difficult to piece together exactly how the Book of Mormon was translated. And I personally feel that we cannot know. There is no time machine. We can't specifically say which day he was using which instrument. And I think there needs to be an element of humility. However, I think it's important to look at the different views and perspectives. And this video, I'm going to be presenting and highlighting 2 prominent books, well, 3 books. The 3 books that we're going to look at is By Means of the Urim and Thummim by Jonathon, Neville and James Lucas, and also recommend my interview with them where we chat for about 2.5 hours on their view of the translation being by the Urim and Thummim with the plates. Also, 2 books by Dirkmaat and Mackay, From Darkness Unto Light, and their book Let's Talk About the Translation of the Book of Mormon. And I've read all 3 of these books prior to doing this episode. I'm going to be drawing a lot on the arguments that they make, their analysis of the sources, before I give my general take. Okay, so this is going to be really Seer Stone versus the Urim and Thummim accounts. And there is a bit of a division because there's some people who would say, no, it was only the Seer Stone in the hat and a Urim and Thummim was never used. There's others that would say, no, Joseph and Oliver only referred to Urim and Thummim, so all of these Seer Stone accounts are either late, they're hearsay, they're all lies, they're not credible. So I'm hoping to have a thoughtful and a nuanced take while I look at the different points of view. Okay, so let's begin by looking at the church's view. So they say Joseph Smith and his scribes, this comes from the church's Gospel Topics essay on Book of Mormon translation. Joseph Smith and his scribes wrote of 2 instruments used in translating the Book of Mormon. According to witnesses of the translation, when Joseph looked into the instruments, the words of scripture appeared in English. One instrument called in the Book of Mormon the Interpreters is better known to Latter-day Saints today as the Urim and Thummim. Joseph found the Interpreters buried in the hill with the plates. The other instrument, which Joseph Smith discovered in the ground years before he retrieved the gold plates, was a small oval stone or seer stone. This he found when he was digging a well at the Willard Chase property in 1822, the brown-coloured Seer Stone. As a young man during the 1820s, Joseph Smith, like others in his day, used a Seer Stone to look for lost objects and buried treasure. As Joseph grew to understand his prophetic calling, he learned that he could use this stone for the higher purpose of translating scripture. Apparently, for convenience, Joseph often translated with the single Seer Stone rather than the two stones bound together to form the Interpreters. There's a quote from Martin Harris supporting that, and you might even interpret the Josiah Stone's interview with Oliver Cowdery, where Oliver Cowdery apparently says to him that he translated that record either using one or two stones. These two instruments, the Interpreters and the Seer Stone, were apparently interchangeable and worked in much the same way, such that in the course of time, Joseph and his associates often used the term Urim and Thummim to refer to the single stone as well as the Interpreters. My slight pushback would be, as I've read through a lot of the statements by Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith, they seem to be referring to the Urim and Thummim as the Interpreters that came with the plates. Although I think it's very possible that the term Urim and Thummim was later used to support any sort of translation instrument. Some accounts indicate that Joseph studied the characters on the plates. Most of the accounts speak of Joseph's use of the Urim and Thummim, either the Interpreters or the Seer Stone, and many accounts refer to his use of a single stone. According to these accounts, Joseph placed either the Interpreters or the Seer Stone in a hat, pressed his face into the hat to block out extraneous light, and read aloud the English words that appeared on the instrument. The process, as described, brings to mind a passage from the Book of Mormon that speaks of God preparing a stone which shall shine forth in darkness unto light. So I actually agree quite a bit with the church's gospel topics essay. I think it's quite a good overview, and we'll get more into the details and the arguments. So we're going to start with Neville and Lucas, their book By the Means of the Urim and Thummim. So their view is that Joseph and Oliver were the principal participants in producing the Book of Mormon, as published in 1830. They repeatedly testify, that's Joseph and Oliver, about the translation with the Interpreters, and never once referred to a stone in a hat or any other method of translation to understand what was written on the gold plates. They also say that more senior historians were rejecting Oliver and Joseph's testimonies in favor of giving priority to the SITH narrative. So basically they're saying that Joseph and Oliver in their primary statements refer to the translation being done by the Urim and Thummim or the Nephite interpreters, and they feel that a lot of historians are privileging the later stone in a hat accounts versus what the primary statements are from Joseph and Oliver. I like what they have to say here, because a controversy often brought up is, did the church hide the Seer Stone accounts? And I think David Snell has a really good video on Saints Unscripted about looking at the historical record of the belief about the Seer Stone over time, and even actually before the mid 20th century, that there were some statements from church leaders acknowledging the Seer Stone, but it was the real correlated official history, as in Joseph's history, was the Urim and Thummim, and Joseph Fielding Smith didn't believe the Seer Stone accounts. He didn't think they were reliable. So I don't think it was out of sinister motives that the church was intentionally hiding the Seer Stone, but it really just was de-emphasized, and Joseph and Oliver's testimony and view of the history was privileged. They say that almost all of the stone in a hat accounts came from people who either broke with Joseph during his lifetime or did not follow the LDS Church westward emigration under Brigham Young. While the SITH accounts were noted in LDS Church histories, they were not given preferential placement. It is likely most LDS Church members were unfamiliar with them. Instead, most church histories and artwork emphasize the canonical translation account found in the Pearl of Great Price. And I think that is a very fair take, that was privileged, where the accounts of Joseph and Oliver were preferenced above these stone in a hat accounts that come often later. So their general take on the stone in a hat accounts, and read their book to go more specifically into certain ones, and they talk about, David Whitmer, Martin Harris, and Emma Smith in our interview as well, which you can check out. I'll link in the description. But they say that sources written close in time to the events are generally considered more reliable than those written down long after the events. First-hand sources are generally given more weight than second-hand sources, which I think that would be the historical approach to most sources or accounts. You want to have first-hand accounts from the individuals who were the eyewitnesses, and it's better if it's closer to the event. They say by 1870, even among believers, the SITH accounts, I think it's quite funny that they call it the SITH, was being advanced despite being initially spread by the anti-LDS book Mormonism Unveiled. Emma reverted to the SITH claims of McClellan and others to provide an answer to refute the Spalding theory and support the divine origin of the Book of Mormon. So what they're saying here is really by the late 1800s, by 1870, the Spalding theory was ramping up and they're trying to move away from this Urim and Thummim behind a veil to this stone in a hat account. And they're going to talk about in a minute why they think Emma's testimony may not be reliable. They say that SITH advocates selectively cite a few generally late, often posthumous, I don't know how to say that, second-hand accounts supporting their position, but ignore the fact that the overwhelming consensus of the contemporary believers in the Book of Mormon was that Joseph used the interpreters to translate it. Now, my only pushback would be that while, yes, some of them are late and some of them you could say are second-hand, there are a lot of people who either talk about interpreters or Seer Stone in a hat. You've got Emma Smith, you've got David Whitmer, although some of his accounts, there's a lot of conflicting statements about Urim and Thummim versus Seer Stone. You've got Martin Harris, you've got like Michael Morse, Elizabeth Cowdery, Joseph Knight Sr., others. So there's quite a few statements referring to stone in a hat or one of the translation instruments being put in a hat. So their view on Emma's testimony, they would say, this comes from their book, we don't know how much of Emma's last testimony was crafted by Joseph III, who did the interview, how much was being influenced by him. She denied Joseph's plural marriage, so can we accept her testimony at face value? That's often used, I think, by the Stoddards as well. Emma lied about polygamy, so then, you can't trust her account of the translation of the Book of Mormon. Emma never saw the plates or the Urim and Thummim, and this was during the context of refuting the Solomon Spalding manuscript. Obviously, if this was coming from Emma firsthand, and this wasn't influenced by Joseph III, I still think Emma's a very reliable witness. David Whitmer, they say about him, he was never a scribe for Joseph. He never saw the plates and the interpreters until after the dictation of the text in Fayette was completed. With one possible exception, he never witnessed the dictation process. So they have this theory about a demonstration being done, and that's what David Whitmer might have witnessed. Now, I understand that he wasn't present for the whole translation. However, it was in his home, and I would think that David Whitmer would have witnessed at least more than one occurrence of the Book of Mormon translation, in my opinion. Almost all of his copious accounts were based on what is heard or inferred, not on what he actually himself saw. Well, I don't know, because even if he's talking about, like, this is the mode by which the translation was done, even if he doesn't say this is what I saw or witnessed, I think it's also implied. And there's one account that talks about David Whitmer being a cognizant witness who was present. So even though he wasn't one of the scribes, I still think, although there are conflicting statements by David Whitmer, and that does call into question the reliability of all of his statements, I also think we can't just throw him out. They say Joseph Smith III says that Joseph and Oliver emphatically stated it was the Nephite interpreters the Book of Mormon was translated by. Joseph Smith III continues that even then the stone was evidently not the chief instrument, so he wasn't persuaded by these stone in the hat accounts. Referring to Joseph and Oliver, Joseph III's notes states that it must be allowed that those men best knew by what means the Book of Mormon was translated, and the chief instrument was the interpreters. So he's obviously privileging that Joseph and Oliver were the principal participants in the translation of the Book of Mormon. They talk about the Urim and Thummim or the Nephite interpreters, so we have to trust their statements. They also go on to say that since Emma, like David Whitmer, was never allowed to see the Urim and Thummim interpreters in use, their comments on the translation process are to be disregarded. I don't know if I think they should be disregarded. I would push back there. So this is their theory. They have a demonstration hypothesis. So rather than saying that Emma, David Whitmer, Elizabeth Cowdery, Joseph Knight Sr., and others, that they are just lying or making up the stone in a hat account, they believe that Joseph would have performed a demonstration to satisfy people's curiosity because they couldn't have seen the gold plates in the Urim and Thummim. So this comes from Gurley, who interviewed Whitmer in 1885. He says David and Emma, in the nature of things, did not know just how the Urim and Thummim were used, as they had never seen them, which led Gurley to discount their statements, explaining that no one was allowed to see either the plates or the Urim and Thummim except permitted by command of God. This strict prohibition did not apply to the Seer Stone. This stone was frequently exhibited to different ones and helped assuage their awful curiosity, but the Urim and Thummim never, unless possibly to Oliver Cowdery. I think John Whitmer also talks about the Urim and Thummim, actually Joseph having the breastplate on. This suggests an alternative solution. Everyone was telling the truth by what they actually observed, but some also reported hearsay inferences as fact. A careful reading of the record suggests that Joseph performed demonstrations with the Seer Stone to satisfy curiosity about his work. So they're getting this theory of demonstrations being done by, I think it was Zenas Gurley, who interviewed John Whitmer and some of the other witnesses of the translation, David Whitmer and maybe Emma as well. So he's saying that David and Emma aren't reliable because they never saw the Urim and Thummim. Only Oliver did, possibly John Whitmer, and that Joseph might have been performing demonstration if people came to observe the translation. And, was it just one demonstration? Was there multiple? Not sure. So that would be their theory. All those people that talk about stone in the hat, they're getting it from a demonstration that Joseph did because he couldn't have shown the plate and the Urim and Thummim. And they say possibly for when Joseph was doing revelations in the early years of the church, Joseph could have popped out one of the stones from the Urim and Thummim and put it in a hat to obtain revelations. And then they might have witnessed that, and then they might have assumed, that's how the Book of Mormon was translated, for example, David Whitmer. They also talk about there being a veil. So Joseph always dictated from behind a blanket or screen. He had been explicitly commanded not to show the plates or interpreters to anyone until the translation was complete. Mormonism Unveiled focused on the question, what was behind the veil when Joseph was dictating? Now, we are going to look at some of the statements that talk about there being a veil or a blanket. And yes, Joseph either had to have a veil or a blanket to cover the plates, but there's also accounts from Emma, the interview with Joseph Smith III, and also statements from Martin Harris about the plates being covered. Isaac Hales talked about the plates sometimes not even being in the room. And my response to this is that while they're saying Mormonism Unveiled is all about there being a veil, the quote that I read in the last episode from E.D. Howe also speaks about the stone in the hat being used part of the translation. And I believe that the source for E.D. Howe, for there being a veil or a curtain, would have come from Charles Anton. And Martin Harris visited Charles Anton before the translation began. That's when Joseph was copying the characters from the plates. And this was before Martin even participated as a scribe in the translation. So this, speaking of a curtain or a veil, could have been right at the beginning before the translation even happened. Their conclusion basically on the Seer Stone accounts. Modern SITH proponents are privileging the SITH narrative over the canonical narrative, simply accepting the SITH accounts at face value without subjecting them to critique or evaluation. Oliver's testimony is the closest we will come to an accurate account of what Joseph experienced. The key point is that Joseph was using the interpreter instruments to interact with the engravings on the plates. Okay, so we're going to look now at Jerry Dirkmaat and Michael Mackay's view or take on the translation. And some of this I have copied quotes from their book From Darkness Unto Light. Other things I have just sort of taken pictures because it was just taking way too long for me to just type out all the quotes. So I've just taken pictures from their other book. Let's talk about the Book of Mormon translation. So they say that all of the witnesses of the translation describe Joseph using the Seer Stone or a single Seer Stone to translate the Book of Mormon, referring to them variously as interpreters, Urim and Thummim, spectacles, stones, crystals, etc. Now, there was a quote from Truman Coe. They say that this is an early account and includes the concept of looking through the spectacles, but they're saying that he wasn't an eyewitness. An interpretation given by Truman Coe, a pastor, and he was an antagonist of the church. They go on to say that the plates were the object of inspiration, but not the object of analysis and careful secular translation, as Coe bemoaned. According to Emma, the plates often lay on the table without any attempt of concealment. So they're saying that Coe was not an eyewitness, and he's also an antagonist to the church. So they don't believe that his account of the interpreters looking at the plates is credible. Although I do believe that Truman Coe is saying that he's getting this information from Joseph Smith. I'm not sure if it was a conversation or an interview of sorts. So even though if he is an antagonist, I feel like we can't just dismiss this statement. And I'm also open to maybe the plates were consulted or used in part of the translation? So they also answer, was there a breastplate being used? So they refer to an interview that William Smith gave. The only account I could find explicitly referring to a breastplate was the one by John Whitmer as well. But they say the most notable account that draws direct comparisons with the Urim and Thummim and the Nephite interpreters comes from an interview of William Smith in 1891. J.W. Peterson published the interview years later in 1924. The breastplate was ostensibly intended to be fastened to the chest, and the spectacles were then supposed to be fastened to the breastplate. Though this was possible, since Joseph's history stated that he was given a breastplate with the Nephite interpreters, early accounts only describe Joseph setting the breastplate aside. As an alternative to the breastplate, he placed the spectacles into the bottom of the hat, allowing him to better control the distance from his eyes to the surface of the stones. The hat allowed Joseph to move the spectacles up and down as needed so he could focus on the translation. It also darkened the area around the seer stones to allow them, as the Book of Mormon explains, to shine forth in darkness unto light. Now, interesting, I always believed that Martin was the principal scribe for the 116 pages, but according to as I read through their book, that he likely only was the scribe for about 1/3 of the Book of Mormon translation. And they say that while Latter-day Saints commonly teach that Joseph Smith used a sheet to veil the plates while he translated with Martin Harris, it seemed to be something that occurred before the translation begun. It's hard to believe that Smith hung up a sheet between them during their translation in the summer of 1828. Joseph may have used the sheet at one point to hide the plates from others who were in the room. It was evidently before Harris began writing for Smith in April 1828. They say the curtain or sheet comes from Charles Anton when Martin explained the translation to him in February 1828, including the story of a sheet separating both of them. Harris hadn't participated in any translation by this stage. It would be impossible for him to give an eyewitness account of how it was translated. Anton was confusing Harris's description of how Smith copied characters with later reports of the actual translation process. While it later became a popular way to describe Joseph's translation, it seems that Joseph only used the sheet when he had the plates exposed in front of him while he transcribed the characters from the plates in the winter of 1827. John Clark, who saw copies of the characters before Harris helped Joseph with the translation, was the only other person to describe a sheet being used to separate Joseph and his scribe. So it's interesting that it's likely the sources referring to there being a curtain or a sheet separating is coming from Charles Anton and John Clark, who are getting information from Harris before he actually participated as a scribe in the translation, indicating that it's likely that it was only used a curtain or a veil when Joseph was copying the characters before the translation happened. So they would hold to that Joseph altered or switched in between the Seer Stone or the Urim and Thummim. They say Martin Harris further explained that at one point during the translation, in order to make the mechanics of translation easier, Joseph stopped using the spectacles. Rather than continuing to work with the awkwardly large spectacles, according to Harris, Joseph began using a single seer stone instead of the spectacles. He stated that Joseph possessed the seer stone, by which he was enabled to translate as well as the Urim and Thummim, and for convenience he then used the seer stone. For Wilford Woodruff, this transition from the device containing two stones to a single stone was as fulfillment of a prophecy in the Book of Mormon that Gazlim, a seer stone, would be used to bring forth the ancient records of the Nephites. So he's saying that the Urim and Thummim was awkward, the interpreters were too big, that he would put them in a hat, but he would also alternate between the spectacles and also a seer stone. And we also have Harris's story to Edward Stevenson of the stone swapping incident. Now, they have an interesting theory, which I hadn't considered before, that the Book of Mormon, of course, we know that the Urim and Thummim, or the Nephite interpreters, were prepared for the purpose of translating the plates. But they also are saying that another stone was prepared, Gazlim, which is likely Joseph's brown seer stone. They say he used the spectacles like a seer stone to identify or find lost items, unlike his later use of them to translate ancient characters. Some LDS histories and art typically depict Joseph with the spectacles as if they were the only device Joseph used in the translation. Yet, church leaders and church-sponsored histories have identified the fact that Joseph did not just use spectacles. It turns out that Joseph Smith's seer stone was prepared by God. According to the Book of Mormon, unlike the Nephite interpreters, was buried in the earth where Joseph would eventually find it. So in Mosiah 28, verse 13, it describes the purpose of these stones, or interpreters as they're referred to, and that there are stones fastened to two rims of a bow, matching the description of the translation device the angel first told Joseph was buried with the plates. That's in Mosiah 28, verse 13 to 16, and that the use of these stones constitute seers, used to translate ancient languages. But Gazlam is also referred to in Alma 37. They say when discussing how these things would be declared to the world, they revealed that the Lord said, I will prepare unto my servant Gazlam a stone, which shall shine forth in the darkness unto light. I think it's really interesting that it talks about Gazlam being a stone, singular, and it talks about it shining in the darkness unto light. And a lot of accounts refer to the stone being put in a hat to sort of block out the light, and that the spiritual light would shine. And they're saying that Joseph using a seer stone was also one of the instruments prepared and prophesied of in the Book of Mormon, not just the Nephite interpreters. Because yeah, it seems kind of weird, like if the main instruments prepared was the interpreters, then why the heck is he switching to a stone which he used in folk magic and treasure digging? But they're stating that this was likely also prepared to be used in the translation coming forth of the Book of Mormon. Well, they have to say of the stone in the hat accounts. They say the witnesses of the translation were neither ashamed nor baffled by the use of the hat as a tool to aid the translation process. That's true. Like they're not saying that they're talking about the Seer Stone, the hat account, but they're saying like this was miraculous. Like, this is by the gift and power of God. They explain that Joseph needed to make the area around the seer stones dark so he could see the writing that would appear on the stones. For instance, Joseph Smith Sr., one of the few friends Joseph Smith had during this early period of translation, explained that the purpose of the hat was to block out ambient light in the room in order to see the words as they appeared on the seer stones, quite consistent with other statements as well, such as Emma Smith and David Whitmer. And they say that you can't set aside or just dismiss the eyewitness testimonies of David Whitmer or Emma Smith or Martin Harris, as well as the other people like Elizabeth Cowdery. They say at times the testimony of these witnesses have been dismissed by modern Latter-day Saints, confronted with these descriptions which may seem foreign to how they previously envisioned the process of translation. Some have invoked the apostasies of Martin Harris, Emma Smith, and David Whitmer as a way to discard their testimonies. However, one can take a much more measured approach. One can recognize that though some of these witnesses of the translation left the church, Joseph Knight Sr., for example, didn't, none ever denied their testimony of the gold plates or of Joseph Smith as the translator of the Book of Mormon. So you can't even say that, oh, they're trying to discredit Joseph Smith because they didn't follow the church and they're trying to say that he used a seer stone in the hat as a way to discredit it. But no, they're trying to say that like it was miraculous. It was translated by the gift and power of God. So we can't just throw them out because these people later didn't follow the church, because they continue to testify of the authenticity of the plates and of Joseph being a prophet. Indeed, Latter-day Saints correctly and proudly affirm that none of these witnesses of the gold plates ever denied their testimony. It is consistent to herald the witnesses' testimonies about the existence of the gold plates, but then to cast aside their explanation of translation that they provided at the same time they were affirming the truthfulness of the work. That's a good point. And so they also make the statement that some anti-Mormons were mocking the stone in a hat method of translation. Like we've seen the South Park episode, which kind of makes fun of it. So they say, why then would Emma describe the process of translation by repeating the description given by Howe, who hated Joseph and mocked the miracle, rather than describing how it actually occurred? If the process involved neither seer stones nor hat, what motivation would Emma have in making that claim while still desperately defending Joseph as a prophet? Now, I know Neville and Lucas' response would be, we don't know how much of this is really coming from Emma Smith, or is this influenced by Joseph Smith III? And this is in the context of the Solomon Spalding manuscript. So obviously, if there was a veil or a curtain, there could have possibly been a manuscript. I think it's still a bit of a conspiracy. But if he's looking at spectacles or a stone in a hat, there's no way he could be looking at a manuscript. They also say Martin Harris affirmed his testimony, and he also, though disconnected from Emma Smith, so they're not corroborating the seer stone in the hat account together, provides a false explanation that he knew he was ridiculed by antagonists of the gold plates in the Book of Mormon. And they also talk about Jonathan Hadley's account, which we'll talk about in a bit. His earliest agrees with David Whitmer, and historians have concluded that the translation process must have included some way involving placing I've cut out the rest of the quote, but must be placing either the seer stone or spectacles in a hat. Now, they say after the publication of the term Urim and Thummim in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, so it wasn't in the original 1833 Book of Commandments, but that then the term Urim and Thummim was really used for the translation of the Book of Mormon over spectacles or interpreters. They say most of the history of the early church was written after 1838. By the time that later history was written in 1839, Joseph was using the term Urim and Thummim to reference any seer stone, not just the ones that had originally been found in the stone box with the plates. While I think some of the later references to Urim and Thummim may not be exclusively referring to the interpreters, but when they say the Urim and Thummim that was found with the plates, then that I think is definitely referring to the Nephite interpreters. They say this changing terminology makes it very difficult to determine which stone or device is being referenced, since all seer stones, even the separate stone showed to Wilford Woodruff in 1841, were called Urim and Thummim by Joseph Smith. Joseph came to see this term as a generic descriptor of a seer stone, rather than a reference only to the stones found in the stone box. So again, my pushback is his statements, though, Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, when they referred to the Urim and Thummim that was found with the plates, that is obviously just referring to the interpreters. However, I think other later statements referring to Urim and Thummim, or the Urim and Thummim being used in some of the early revelations, could be a reference to his seer stone. They're saying that later that Joseph and early saints were using the term Urim and Thummim, adopting like the Old Testament's use of Urim and Thummim to refer to any sort of seer stone, be it the Nephite interpreters or Joseph's singular seer stone. Now, they would also say that Urim and Thummim doesn't exclusively refer to just the Nephite interpreters, because they say that Joseph taught the place God resides was a great Urim and Thummim, and that this earth in its sanctified and immortal state will be like unto a crystal and will be a Urim and Thummim. He also further declared that the white stone mentioned in Revelation 2:17 will become a Urim and Thummim to each individual who receives one, whereby things pertaining to a higher order of kingdoms will be made known, and a white stone is given to each of those who come into the celestial kingdom. So I would agree that Joseph doesn't just use the term Urim and Thummim only for the interpreters. I think his statements with regards to Book of Mormon translation is just in relation to the interpreters. I don't think any of Joseph's statements refer to a singular stone. However, if he's calling where God resides a Urim and Thummim, or that each of us will receive a white stone, which is called a Urim and Thummim, then I think he obviously views it expanding and not just exclusive to the Nephite interpreters. So they talk about the Jonathon Hadley account. I think this is a key account for me. Hadley also used the peculiar term spectacles to describe the device containing the two seer stones that was found with the plates, though his recitation of Joseph's explanation of the translation was filled with incredulity. So Hadley, he was a Palmyra printer who Joseph shared with him the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. Hadley explained by placing the spectacles in a hat and looking into it, Smith could, he said so at least, interpret these characters. So he's claiming that Joseph Smith told him that he put the spectacles inside a hat, looked into it, and then could interpret the characters on the gold plates. Joseph Smith's first written account of the translation of the Book of Mormon also described the stones as spectacles. God had prepared the spectacles so he could translate. Thus, this earliest published account of translation described the same process of placing the stones in a hat to block out the light, a description that Emma, Martin, David, and Joseph Knight Sr. affirmed. So I feel like this account, in my mind, it seems quite credible, even though he's dismissive and doesn't believe Joseph Smith. But Joseph Smith is telling him, yeah, I used the Urim and Thummim, or the Nephite interpreters. But a lot of Joseph's statements don't refer to the actual mechanics or method, but he's referring to spectacles in a hat, which would align with a lot of the other witnesses who talk about either the seer stone or spectacles going into a hat. He also goes on to talk about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith, in the fall of 1827, had a dream. The Spirit of the Almighty was told to go to a certain hill where there was a golden Bible containing an ancient record. He was visited 3 times. That found with the plates was a huge pair of spectacles, and that Martin Harris had taken some of the characters copied from the gold plates to the east to the renowned professor Samuel Mitchell. They say evidence that his knowledge came directly from Joseph Smith is further bolstered by Hadley's explanation of the gold plates, which provide the same dimensions that Joseph would himself later publish, but in 1829 had not even publicly declared The leaves of the Bible were plates of gold, wrote Hadley, about 8 inches long, 6 wide. So they're going to say that with Hadley's account, he knew details of how Joseph obtained the plates, their exact size, and about Martin's trip to the scholars in the East, as well as the translation process. He could only have gotten these details from a conversation with Joseph Smith or one of the witnesses to the translation. Hadley averred that he had talked to Joseph himself. So even though this is secondhand, where would he have learned all these information from? And while he's writing about it skeptically, he's very accurate about the details. Because Hadley did not think Joseph Smith or the Book of Mormon would amount to anything, he did not feel the need to embellish or distort the story of the plates. He dismissed it for sure. And what about Oliver? Did he ever mention spectacles or a stone in a hat? This was quite interesting to me. So they have in their book in 1830 on his way to preach to the American Indians. In what is today Kansas, a local Shaker leader recorded Cowdery's description of the process, which also involved Joseph Smith using a hat along with the Seer Stones. They also talk about Cowdery reporting the translation process to Josiah Jones, who was an early convert. So he's claiming that being told by Oliver Cowdery and the other missionaries that Joseph Smith had found the gold plates and had translated it by looking into a stone or 2 stones when put into a dark place, which stones, he said, were found in the box with the plates. So again, you could interpret this as this is Oliver talking about the spectacles, and maybe he's talking about either both stones from the spectacles, one of the stones, maybe even one of the Seer Stones. But again, Josiah Jones, who was an early convert, is saying, this is what I was told by Oliver Cowdery. You have the Shaker leader also referring to stones being put in a hat. After asking Cowdery to give more details of the translation process, Cowdery reportedly explained that Smith looked in or through the transparent stones to translate what was on the plates. So although a lot of their general statements from Oliver and Joseph refer to translating by the Urim and Thummim, I don't think that means that the Urim and Thummim could not have been put inside the hat. So I have here accounts supporting Seer Stone or interpreters in a hat. This comes from page 123 of From Darkness Unto Light. The gold plates were apparently never consulted during the translation either. Now I would push back. I don't think we can know that for 100% certainty, because there are a few sources that refer to Joseph looking at the gold plates. So I don't think we can say like definitively like the plates were never used. Instead, Joseph always had them apparently covered with a cloth or concealed within a box. He likely never correlated any given character on the gold plate with the translated text that appeared on the Seer Stone. He would not have known what the characters meant without the Seer Stones. So their view on the translation mechanics. Whether he was using the spectacles or an individual stone, Joseph apparently used either instrument by placing it in the bottom of a hat in order to block out the ambient light so he could read the words that appeared on the stone. It is difficult to determine exactly which instrument Joseph used to translate at any given time while translating with Oliver Cowdery. While Emma and Joseph Knight Sr. later described Joseph using a single stone for the majority of the process, Joseph apparently told Jonathan Hadley in 1829 that the translation was accomplished by using the spectacles buried in the bottom of a hat. And then you have like Martin Harris, who claimed that he could use either the spectacles or the Seer Stone for convenience. And if both were prepared for the translation, then perhaps both were used alternately, but it's not clear to say which instrument was being used when. So I have in here, why do others say a stone, but Joseph and Oliver say spectacles? So they say Josiah Jones, who said he was baptized by Oliver Cowdery, said that Joseph Smith Jr. had translated the plates by looking into a stone or 2 stones when put into a dark place, which stones he said were found in a box with the plates. Charles Anton was told by Martin Harris that the spectacles were too large for his face. Anton's account may also explain why Cowdery generally described the translation process as involving the interpreters or spectacles, while others stated the latter part of the translation was done with only a single Seer Stone. In fact, it is possible that Joseph may have even removed one of the lenses from the spectacles in order to more easily use it. He also may have simply focused upon one of the 2 lenses while the spectacles lay in the bottom of the hat. Yeah, that's also true as well. Like, we don't know it when they're referring to the single stone in the hat. That could have been one of the Urim and Thummim lenses, maybe even not Joseph's chocolate-colored Seer Stone. Again, we don't really know for 100% certainty. Now, I like what they say after about, well, if the gold plates, say, weren't the primary use of the translation, if it wasn't primarily the Urim and Thummim over the gold plates, then what was the purpose of the plates? And you often say people like, why did the Nephite prophets spend so much time engraving on the plates, carrying them around for years, protecting them, only for Joseph not to use them? So they say the plates needed to be in possession of the seer for the translation to occur, whether he was looking at them or not. Like, in my mind, there would be nothing to translate if there was no written record, whether or not Joseph had them in front of him or not. He had to be translating something. The plates also served as a tangible physical witness that the fantastic work Joseph was engaged in was not merely some flight of fancy or misunderstood dream. They are that tangible witness of the restoration. And even if they weren't primarily used in the translation, you still have the testimony of the 3 and the 8 witnesses that testified to the reality of the gold plates. The gold plates physically manifested to Joseph and all the scribes and witnesses that this endeavor was not merely a misguided dream or even the influence of some evil spirit on Joseph. The gold plates connected the present to the ancient past, declaring via Mormon and Mormonized work the reality of these ancient peoples and prophets. The gold plates were and continue to be the physical proof of Jesus' visit to the Americas and consequently of his resurrection. And some people have proposed of like automatic writing as like a theory for the Book of Mormon of how Joseph was able to do it using, a prop and it just flowing out of him. The gold plates are there as a tangible artifact to support the translation. If there were no gold plates, then it would be quite fishy that Joseph Smith is just claiming to translate in the ancient text. So their conclusion, basically, this comes from their book. Let's talk about the Book of Mormon translation. The scribes and the witnesses of the translation of the Book of Mormon spoke and wrote of the miracles they witnessed multiple times throughout their lives. Their various accounts include several repeated elements. They saw Joseph using seer stones, either the ones found together with the plates, or a separate single stone Joseph had found earlier in his life. They described Joseph placing those stones in his hat, looking into the hat to commence speaking the translated words. Several believed either because Joseph explained it to them, or because they each independently came to the same supposition, that Joseph placed the stones into the hat in order to make the area around the stones dark enough to see the words that divinely appeared on them. Also going to share an Interpeter article by Roger Nicholson called The Spectacles, the Stone, the Hat, and the Book, a 21st century believer's view of the Book of Mormon translation. Really good article, I'll link in the description. So he has to say about the plates. That having been said, there's ample evidence that a curtain or sheet of some kind was used during the early period of translation. Martin Harris is quoted as saying as much in 1831 issue of the Palmyra Reflector. According to the Reflector, Harris declares that when he acted as amanuensis, I don't know how to say that, and wrote the translation, as Smith dictated, such was his fear of the divine displeasure that a screen sheet was suspended between the prophet and himself. He says the use of the curtain to screen the translator from the scribe certainly makes sense if the translation instruments being employed are the Nephite interpreters. This comes from Eber D. Howe's Mormonism Unveiled says, Martin Harris says he wrote a considerable part of the book as Smith dictated, and at one time the presence of the Lord was so great that a screen was hung up between him and the prophet. At other times the prophet would sit in a different room or upstairs while the Lord was communicating to him the contents of the plates. He does not pretend that he ever saw the wonderful plates but once, although he and Smith were engaged for months in deciphering their contents. So while it seems like the Clark and the reference from Anton, that they could be getting this from Anton, it's also very possible that Martin Harris could be describing what was happening initially in the translation process as well, perhaps. So he talks about no curtain reveal. The image of Joseph translating using the stone in the hat does not match the picture that we typically have in our mind of Joseph looking at the plates through a pair of spectacles. While sitting behind a curtain, however, the use of the stone in the hat provides a distinct advantage in bolstering the claim that Joseph received the Book of Mormon text through revelation. The absence of a curtain during the latter part of the translation substantially weakens the critical argument that Joseph dictated the Book of Mormon by plagiarizing a number of other books. Because Elizabeth Cowdery talked about how there was no curtain or veil separating them, that it was just putting his face in the hat. And that would support that, well, he couldn't have been looking at other materials or a manuscript or a book. By the time that the translation resumed after the loss of the 116 pages, the translation method appears to have changed substantially. Even if a blanket or curtain was used in the Whitmer home for any period of time, it appears to have quickly disappeared. So he offers an explanation why a possible switch or alternating between the spectacles and Urim and Thummim. Why did Joseph switch between translating instruments? Was it simply for convenience, as Martin Harris indicated? One possible explanation is that the size of the interpreters may have been a hindrance to their use. William Smith described the Nephite interpreters as much too large for Joseph, and he could only see through one at a time, using sometimes one and sometimes the other. Charles Anton, who had to have obtained this information from Martin Harris, provided additional detail when he wrote that the spectacles were so large that if a person attempted to look through them, would have to be turned towards one of the glasses merely, the spectacles in question being altogether too large for the breadth of the human face. Explaining why Joseph might have taken the spectacles out, put them in a hat, and why he might have alternated between the Seer Stone or the spectacles. He also talks about newspaper reports supporting spectacles in a hat. In February 1830, Martin Harris is quoted in the New York Telescope. Joseph Smith did the business of translating by placing spectacles in a hat, looking into them, and Joseph said he could interpret the characters. In June 1830, the Cincinnati Advertiser mentioned a white stone in a hat, which is quite interesting, saying that Smith would put his face into a hat in which he had a white stone and pretend to read from it, while his coadjutor transcribed. And they say that the reference to a white stone is consistent with Harris's description of the Nephite interpreters, and that these newspaper accounts are entirely consistent with Martin Harris's 1859 description, given 30 years later. We have evidence that Martin Harris, Nicholson says, both at the time that the translation occurred and at the end of his life, perceived that Joseph used the Nephite interpreters or spectacles together with the hat in order to interpret the characters on the gold plates. Martin's description would coincide with the period of time that he acted as scribe, which corresponded with the translation of the 116 lost pages of manuscript. The idea that the Urim and Thummim was placed in a hat sounds quite different from the mental picture that we might have of Joseph using the spectacles like a pair of glasses to view the plates. However, recall that Martin described the stones in the interpreters as white, like polished marble with a few grey streaks. This does not necessarily imply that they were transparent. May I participate in the translation that there could have been a screen or a blanket? I definitely think that's how Joseph copied the characters off the plates. It's possible that could have been done as well at the initial part of the translation. Although Emma doesn't speak of a curtain, she talks about Joseph just dictating with his face in the hat. That accounts for Martin Harris seem to indicate either using the spectacles, likely put in a hat, or for convenience, maybe alternating between the spectacles and the Seer Stone. So this is what they have to say about Joe Smith keeping the Seer Stone quiet. They say, we already know that Joe Smith was reluctant to describe the translation process in detail. Joseph's reticence was probably well justified and may have been due to the inordinate interest which some of the early saints had shown in the Seer Stone, or to the negative and sometimes bitter reactions he encountered when he reported some of his sacred experiences to others. Thus, Joseph never discussed the details regarding which translation instrument he used, both to translate the Book of Mormon and to receive revelation. Joseph simply told people that he received early revelations through the Urim and Thummim. Now, I would push back because when Joseph and Oliver are referring to the Urim and Thummim, they are referencing the Urim and Thummim that came with the plates, the Nephite interpreters. However, I do think that it's likely that Joseph was trying to de-emphasize his folk magic and treasure digging past, although he did acknowledge in his history of being engaged in treasure digging, but that he was a treasure seer. I'm trying to de-emphasize the Seer Stone narrative. They also talk about how Kirkham and Joseph Fielding Smith rejected the Seer Stone. Kirkham, in the October 8, 1939 improvement era, quoted the accounts of the stone in the hat given by Martin Harris and David Whitmer. Kirkham, however, did not accept the eyewitness accounts that Joseph actually used the Seer Stone in the translation of the Book of Mormon. Kirkham simply refused to accept the idea that the accounts might have had basis in the truth. So we talked about earlier in David Snell's video that there are statements from people in the late 19th and earliest 20th century talking about a Seer Stone, but by this stage, by the mid 20th century, the Seer Stone accounts, they were acknowledged, but they were dismissed as not credible. In 1956, Elder Joseph Fielding Smith knew of the Seer Stone, but did not believe that Joseph actually used it during the translation of the Book of Mormon. Like Kirkham, Joseph Fielding Smith simply refused to accept accounts of Joseph having utilized the Seer Stone for the purpose of translation as having any validity. In his opinion, such accounts were simply erroneous.
During the 20th century, the story of Joseph translating behind a curtain while employing the Nephite interpreters as the Urim and Thummim remained firmly established and generally uncontested among the general church membership. Latter-day Saint scholars, however, continue to research the stories of Joseph's use of the Seer Stone. Such references never made it into the general church curriculum or the awareness of general church membership, so the correlated narrative was the Urim and Thummim, the Nephite interpreters. The Seer Stone accounts were dismissed as not credible, as erroneous. However, LDS scholars were likely aware of them. If you were a scholar, then you knew that Joseph used the Seer Stone. If you were a regular member, then you knew that Joseph used the Nephite interpreters. Discussions of Joseph's use of Seer Stones or the practice of treasure digging remain primarily in the realm of LDS scholars. Here's what Nicholson says about statements about Joseph using a Seer Stone. References to the stone being used during the Book of Mormon translation are not confined to the 19th century. Elder Russell L. Nelson quoted David Whitmer's description of the stone in the hat in a July 1993 Ensign. Elder Neil A. Maxwell quoted Martin Harris in the 1997 Ensign, noting that Harris related of the Seer Stone. In the January 1988 Ensign, Church Educational System Area Director Kenneth Godfrey mentioned the Urim and Thummim or the Seer Stone being involved in the translation, and the Brigham Young University professor Richard Lloyd Anderson in September 1977 quotes David Whitmer's statement that Joseph Smith would put the Seer Stone into a hat, put his face in the hat, drawing it closely around his face to exclude the light. So there were a few mentions in Ensign articles, but it does seem like the Seer Stone narrative was de-emphasized. It really wasn't until 2013 did the church really go public, and this was the official narrative, the official history for the translation of the Book of Mormon. So I quite like Roger Nicholson's view, his theory for likely how it could have been translated. So he says that Joseph Smith received the plates and the Nephite interpreters from the angel Moroni. Joseph began the process of translation using the Nephite interpreters with Martin Harris's scribe. A curtain separated the translator from the scribe, thus shielding the plates and the Nephite interpreters from view. So initially in the beginning, there might have been a curtain and Joseph using the interpreters with the plates. Joseph may have placed the Nephite interpreters in a hat in order to shield them from the light, in accordance with the method that he used when utilizing his own Seer Stone, and the accounts from Charles Anton and William Smith about the spectacles being too large. At times, Joseph may have switched to using his own Seer Stone, placing it in the hat. On one such occasion, Martin swapped the stones, which he never would have dared to do had Joseph been using the Nephite instrument. Upon completion of and subsequent loss of the 116 pages, the angel Moroni took back the plates of the Nephite interpreters, and after a sufficient time of repentance, the plates were returned to Joseph along with the Nephite interpreters. He then says Joseph began translating again using either the Nephite interpreters or a Seer Stone, either of which may have been placed in the hat. The witnesses should not necessarily have been able to determine which instrument he was using. This translation process occurred in plain view of those around Joseph, including his scribe Oliver Cowdery. There was no curtain present during this period of the translation process, and we have that account from Elizabeth Cowdery saying that there was no curtain or veil separating them. And I probably lean towards this, that the plates might have been consulted in the early part of the translation, but it seems that for me that the predominant part of the translation was likely done with either the spectacles or the Seer Stone being placed in a hat. And people would have witnessed at least Joseph with his head in a hat, perhaps not being entirely certain which instrument was being consulted when. But Joseph and Oliver seem to refer to the spectacles mostly in the translation.
Okay, so I want to talk about first what I see as the facts and then the interpretation of the facts. So Joseph and Oliver only refer to the Urim and Thummim during the translation, as well as John Whitmer. A small few sources support there being a curtain and the plates being open and the Urim and Thummim going over the plates. Two of those accounts, I think, from John Clark are likely influenced by Charles Anton, and the one by John Clark getting this from Martin Harris, but this was before the translation actually began. Likely when Joseph was copying characters for Martin to take these characters to the east to scholars. Martin Emma and David Whitmer refer to both the Seer Stone and Urim and Thummim during the translation. However, there isn't always consistency which instrument was used when. Because there were some accounts from David Whitmer that say it was the Urim and Thummim up until the loss of the 116 pages, and then Joseph just used a single Seer Stone. We have the Emma Pilgrim letter from Emma, but then there's also statements which contradict that. People like Joseph Knight Sr., Elizabeth Cowdery, Michael Morse also describe either the stone or the spectacles in a hat. Okay, so these are maybe some interpretations you might take from the facts, looking at all of the sources. So you could say that only the Urim and Thummim was used, and all the other Seer Stone in a hat accounts are either late, lies, hearsay, or you could go with Neville and Lucas's theory that they're all coming from a demonstration that Joseph did when people observed, but the predominant translation was done using the Urim and Thummim over the plates, and that a seer stone or putting spectacles in a hat was never part of the translation. Other people might say that only a seer stone was used in a hat and the Urim and Thummim wasn't used. There's even some critics who think the Urim and Thummim was just made up, an invention, and that all eyewitness accounts support the seer stone, and that Joseph and Oliver are just liars. That the Urim and Thummim was used during the 116 pages, but then after it was just the Seer Stone. There's some accounts that support that, but Joseph and Oliver's statements would contradict or conflict with this. Some might say that both the spectacles and the Seer Stone were used throughout the translation, most likely, but it's difficult to determine which instrument was used when. And a fifth possibility is Joseph Smith used a potato and not a Seer Stone. I think if Joseph lived in Ireland in 1829, maybe a potato could have been used instead of a stone. So I'm going to share what is my final thoughts. And I have to say, I don't really know exactly how the Book of Mormon translation was done. As I've looked through a lot of the sources, there's a lot of ambiguity and confusion. Some sources, there's a few sources that say Urim and Thummim with the plates. That was the traditional narrative we grew up with. There's a lot of sources that refer to the Urim and Thummim or spectacles. There's a few that talk about spectacles in a hat, quite a few that talk about seer stone in a hat, and there's quite a few that talk about seer stone or Urim and Thummim being used interchangeably, or that he moved from the Urim and Thummim and then after the last 116 pages, just the seer stone. I want to say that I don't really know. I'm obviously not a trained historian, but even as I've looked at the sources, I can't really piece together exactly how I think it was done. And I think we have to sort of privilege certain sources over another. So I think there's a lot of interpretation here, and there's going to be a lot of privileging certain sources and having to come up with explanations for some that don't align with your theory or view. But here's my general take. I don't really care. It doesn't really matter to me that much exactly the means or the mode of translation. But like, if I were to bet my money, what would I say most likely based upon looking at the sources, what Neville and Lucas have to say, and what historians like Mackay and Dirkmaat have to say? And for me, I'm really personally not bothered that much about, no, it could only have been the gold plates and the interpreters. There's no way Joseph could have translated with a seer stone, so we have to explain away all those other accounts. Like, the paradigm doesn't crumble for me if the gold plates and the Urim and Thummim was the only way it could have been done. It's not a deal breaker for me if the seer stone or spectacles were put in a hat, and that was also how the translation coming forth the Book of Mormon was done. I don't feel motivated to have to explain away all those other accounts. And obviously, people should come to whatever interpretation they feel is most likely, but I think it's important for all of us to acknowledge that not the historical record and the sources on this isn't crystal clear. For example, I've heard some critics say that actually we know from all the sources that Joseph Smith used a seer stone in the hat, and there's no sources that really support a Urim and Thummim. That's just like incorrect. Like, there's so many sources that support a Urim and Thummim or its spectacles. I feel like there's too many, and we even have Lucy Mack Smith who claimed a feel of the spectacles. So I definitely believe that there were spectacles, Nephite interpreters. And for somebody to say that I don't believe a seer stone was ever used, there's also a lot of quotes that support that. So I lean more towards, so I think both the Nephite interpreters, but also the single stone Gaslam, which could have been Joseph Smith's seer stone, were both prepared and both could have been used in the translation of the Book of Mormon. I don't see it as it's either one or the other. It's either the Nephite interpreters or the Seer Stone. I think that there was initially a curtain used when Joseph was copying the characters, and then when Martin Harris took some of the characters to the scholars in the East, and that would explain talking about a curtain or a veil in Mormonism unveiled, as well as the John Clark statement. But this was before Martin Harris was a scribe for the actual translation. I think it's very possible that maybe the gold plates could have been consulted with the spectacles or Urim and Thummim, maybe in the initial part of the translation, maybe even initially when Joseph got to Harmony. But I lean more towards, I think it was either the Seer Stone or the spectacles put in a hat. I think it's interesting that Alma 37 talks about the stone being there to bring forth the words from darkness unto light. But for me, I don't feel like it's completely necessary that the plates had to be consulted. We know in Joseph's other revelatory productions that he was able to reveal text without the document being out in front of him. And when Joseph said it's not for the world to know all the particulars of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, I feel like we don't need to exactly know exactly the mode of translation. Like day 1 to day 4, it was the gold plates in front of me, and I had my finger on one character, and then I was looking at the interpreter. And then day 5 to day 15, I then decided that this isn't very convenient. The spectacles are too big. Let me put them in a hat. And then day 16 to day 20, I switched from the spectacles to a Seer Stone. Like, I feel like it doesn't really matter. Like, I wish there was a time machine. It would be cool to know. And while I think that Neville and Lucas's theory is possible or even plausible, I'm not dismissive of it. I'm not going to say it's wrong or ridiculous, because I think they do try to privilege, Joseph and Oliver statements. They refer to Urim and Thummim, John Whitmer as well, Urim and Thummim. I don't think there's many sources that talk about the plates, but they would assume that when they're talking about the translation being done by the Urim and Thummim, it's obviously the Urim and Thummim with the plates. And when they say that there was a demonstration that was done, and that's why so many people talk about a stone in a hat, that's possible. I just find it unlikely that the people that were there, like Emma, David Whitmer, Elizabeth Cowdery, Michael Morse, Isaac Hale, only witnessed like one demonstration. Like, it seems like they would have been in and out of when the translation was being done. So I feel like Joseph couldn't have just like hidden and then just done this demonstration. Now, it does seem that Joseph and Oliver, they seem to talk about the Urim and Thummim, or the spectacles, and de-emphasize the Seer Stone. When some of the accounts refer to a singular stone in a hat, I don't know if that's referring to Joseph Smith's chocolate-colored Seer Stone, or if it's just referring to one of the stones from the spectacles. Again, I feel like there's a lot of ambiguity. But what I think is most likely is, particularly with the Jonathon Hadley source that he's getting from Joseph Smith, and the two sources that are coming secondhand from Oliver Cowdery, referring to a seer stone or multiple stones, the spectacles being put in a hat. I find it quite likely that those are coming from Joseph and Oliver, and that's most likely how the translation was done, and that all the eyewitnesses who speak about a stone in a hat, that they are not inconsistent with Joseph and Oliver's statements. Because Joseph and Oliver, when they talk about it was translated by the Urim and Thummim, they don't explicitly talk about exactly the method, but I feel like those secondhand accounts corroborate and are consistent with the other eyewitness accounts. And I also feel like, making the argument that we can only really trust Joseph and Oliver's statements, and, they're the principal participants, they're the most contemporary accounts, and ignore all of these later accounts from other people, is a very similar argument that people make who deny that Joseph was a polygamist. They say, well, Joseph denied he was a polygamist, Emma denied he was a polygamist, they would know, and that all of these later statements and accounts and writings in people's journals, they're all late after the fact. And Joseph and Emma would know if Joseph was a polygamist. I feel like it's just not as easy to say that, and you're just denying all of this other evidence. And also, I think it's way too binary to say either you believe Joseph and Oliver, or you're calling them liars if you believe in these stone and hat accounts, because I think you can make sense of it that likely both instruments might have been used throughout the translation process. And that's what I find most likely or most probable, looking at the full summation of all these sources. But I don't think we'll know for sure. I don't think there's any time machine. And I'm perfectly comfortable with, the Urim and Thummim being used with the gold plates initially, then interpreters being put in a hat. Maybe for convenience, he alternated between the Seer Stone or the spectacles, like Martin Harris alluded to. So I am more persuaded that most likely the predominant method of translation was likely either the spectacles or Seer Stone being put in a hat. I feel like that helps to account for the majority of the statements of eyewitnesses, but I also think we can make sense of the Urim and Thummim statements, because it likely as well could have been put inside the hat. But again, I may be wrong. If people lean more with Neville and Lucas's theory, totally understand. I respect it. I think they've dived in very deeply and they've tried to come up with ways to account for these other sources. I'm just not fully persuaded by it. And, if Joe Smith had translated with a potato in a hat, for me, the most important thing about the Book of Mormon is the text of the Book of Mormon. While I think these are important and interesting historical questions, ultimately I think it is the text of the Book of Mormon and the miraculous time frame that it came forth in is what matters most. And again, if there's some things which I'm not accounting for or ignoring, leave them in the comments. You're totally free to pick what you think is the most likely interpretation for the translation of the Book of Mormon. I think it's just important to have clarity on the subject. Let's agree on the facts. Let's agree on what the sources are. And then we can debate over interpretation or which sources are more reliable than others. But those are my thoughts. Thanks everyone for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, like, share, and subscribe. Check out their books. Check out links in the description. We'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.